Born into slavery and hardship, Julia Chinn spent her childhood labouring much like any other slave. Yet her life changed when she was sent to the plantation of Richard Mentor Johnson, a rising politician and future Vice President of the United States. Johnson soon took Julia as his concubine, beginning a relationship that was unusual, controversial, and deeply complex. She helped manage his household and raise their children, yet he never granted her freedom. So why did he keep her enslaved? And why was she almost erased from history? Trying to figure out who Julia Chinn was, especially the details of her earliest years, is not an easy task. Demographic records were imprecisely kept in the late 18th century, especially when it came to people who were born into slavery. For instance, we know that Julia Chinn was born in the 1790s, but even her leading biographer could only narrow the range down to sometime between 1790 and 1797. That's as precise as anyone can be with the available evidence. One set of sources claim she was born in 1790. Others state that she was about 15 or 16 years old in 1812, meaning she was born around 1796 or 1797. In the same way, there is not a lot of detail about her parents or background. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Henrietta. It is believed that her father was a free white man whose surname she was given, as there was a prominent settler family in this part of Kentucky named Chinn. Nevertheless, it is easier to identify who Julia's enslavers were. She was born on the plantation of Robert Sugg Johnson and his wife Jemima in the Bluegrass region of Kentucky, which at the time was out on the western frontier of the United States of America. The Johnsons had moved out west to Kentucky as some of the first Euro-American settlers there in the 1770s. Robert worked as a surveyor and land assessor, helping map the future colonization of Kentucky. They had many children, but it was their fifth son, Richard Mentor Johnson, born there in 1870, who would be crucial to this story. At the time of his birth, slavery was viewed widely by many white Americans not as a moral crisis, but as an ordinary and even necessary institution woven into the expansion of the western frontier, as we shall soon see. Kentucky had been settled by people moving westwards out of Virginia from the 1760s onwards, and was admitted as the 15th state of the Union in 1792. Slave ownership was fully legal here, and the question of whether new states should permit slavery had not yet become the fierce political battle it would turn into beginning in the 1810s. Despite its position as a slave-owning agricultural state with a plantation economy, Kentucky also quickly became the home to the largest free black population of any state in the US. This was because slaves who had acquired their freedom in places like Virginia were often the first to move out west to acquire their own small farm or live away from where they had been enslaved. On top of this, there was still a large Native American population here in Julia's time, tribes like the Creek and the Choctaw. This created a state where the social rules about how white settlers, black people and the natives interacted were different than in other states, and this racial mixing would shape Julia's life. Although Julia was born to an enslaved woman, she was far from being of pure West African descent. The full details of her ethnicity are a source of controversy though. Most studies confidently assert that she was an octoroon. This is a term that is used frequently today to refer to people who are only 1/8 of African descent, while 7/8 of European or white American ancestry. While there are a handful of cases where this occurred in the pre-Civil War history of the United States, it was extremely rare. It was not actually the case with Julia. While she was said to be lighter skinned than many other slaves of the time, she was most likely a quadroon at most, meaning she possessed at least 1/4 African ancestry. We also can't really be sure what she looked like. Cameras had not become available before she died, and drawings of her from the 19th century might not be entirely accurate. Regardless of her being primarily of European or white American descent, Julia was treated much like any other enslaved child. Her mother, Henrietta, was given food for herself and her children that was far too little for the grueling labour they were expected to perform. They survived by growing small amounts of beans, cabbage and potatoes in the slave garden, but like many enslaved people, They were chronically short of protein and constantly undernourished. Julia's early years were marked by hardship and deprivation, yet as she grew into her teenage years, her life would take a turn that tied her fate directly into the powerful Johnson family in ways few could have imagined. Julia's life did not get easier when she was in her teenage years. At this time, Julia was separated from her mother and her sister and was sent to live in the household of Richard Mentor, the Johnsons' younger son. Johnson was around 30 years old and was already an ambitious rising figure in Kentucky politics. He had established his own household at Blue Spring Farm, a substantial estate where he lived independently. Johnson was unmarried and, in fact, he would never marry in the traditional sense. According to later accounts, when he was around 16, he had proposed to a young woman, but his mother strongly disapproved of the match and pressured him to break it off. Some stories claim that the incident left a lasting mark on him, and that Johnson vowed never again to let his mother or anyone else dictate his personal life. Whether or not that vow was truly made, the decision would shape the unconventional domestic arrangement that soon emerged at Blue Spring Farm. Well, when Julia was sent there, she quickly became his concubine. One hesitates to use a term like they entered a relationship or some such here, because clearly this was not a consensual arrangement for Julia at first, although the nature of their relationship did become more complicated over time. Also, Julia's exact age at the time that all of this happened is unclear. If she was born around 1796 or 1797, she was only around 14 years old when she was sent to live with Richard. If she was born years earlier, around 1790, she was already entering her 20s. What's more concretely known is that she gave birth to a daughter named Imogen in 1812. A second daughter named Adeline followed soon afterwards. There is little doubting that Richard was the father of the two girls. Clearly, his and Julia's relationship was complex by this time. She remained a slave, but there is evidence that he referred to her as his wife, and he freely introduced Imogen and Adeline as his daughters when visitors called to Blue Spring Farm. They also carried the Johnson surname. Eventually, he arranged for them to be given land of their own, while most historians classify Richard and Julia as eventually being in a kind of unofficial common law marriage, outside of the normal legal structures. Richard Mentor Johnson is primarily known today for serving as Vice President of the United States between 1837 and 1841, when Martin Van Buren was the president. But his political career stretched over 46 years. He was first elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives in 1804. 3 years later, he headed to Washington, D.C. to represent Kentucky in Congress as a member of the Federal House of Representatives. He held that position until 1819, when he managed to win an election as a U.S. Senator from Kentucky, followed by 8 years back in the House from 1829, and then his spell as Vice President. Although Julia would not live to see Johnson become the Vice President, his political career was important in shaping her life trajectory. Since he never married a white woman or started what would have been a more conventional family by early 19th century standards, while he was off in Washington, D.C. for about 6 months out of every year, she basically ran Blue Spring Farm in Kentucky. This was a plantation farm with lots of slaves there. Julia managed it. She dealt with the contractors who purchased their produce, and she bought supplies for the household and farm. She also organized and ran social functions, many of which had to be held when Richard arrived back to Kentucky from Washington and met with local politicians and business people. Julia was said to play the piano very well and helped create the refined atmosphere expected at such gatherings. When Johnson departed again each year for Washington to pursue his political career, he even left her in charge of the cash he withdrew beforehand, an unusual level of trust for an enslaved woman in that era. One striking element of Julia's work as the manager of the Blue Spring Farm was the establishment of the Choctaw Academy on the farm. This was a boarding school which was built on the farm for Native American boys. It was in operation for around a decade under Julia's management. In some ways, this was an extension of Julia's work in educating her own daughters. She employed a local minister and preacher, Thomas Henderson, to educate Imogen and Adeline, and then Henderson also started teaching at the school. The Choctaw Academy is still partly standing to this day. At Blue Spring Farm in Kentucky, the shell of the building stands in a field, although bushes and trees have long since pushed in through the walls, and the roof has largely collapsed after more than a century of neglect. Yet, for anyone who lives in this part of Kentucky, there is still a living piece of Julia Chinn's life story visible there to go and see. While this all seems to indicate a relationship based on near equality between Julia and Richard by the 1820s, it was far more complex than first appears. For instance, the local community in Kentucky tolerated the unusual union between their congressman and his quote-unquote wife, but they clearly cast criticisms on them behind closed doors. Moreover, their relationship was deeply unusual and shaped by the laws and racial boundaries of the time. In 1815, after the death of his father, Johnson came into full legal ownership of Julia. Yet he did not set her free. She remained legally enslaved, even as he openly acknowledged their daughters and raised them as his own. Historians have suggested that Johnson may have avoided freeing Julia because emancipation might have weakened what one scholar described as the ties that bound her to him. Also, under the law at the time, interracial marriage was banned in Kentucky, so even if he did free Julia, they could not legally marry anyway. Julia did, however, have influence within the household. She arranged for her brother Daniel and his family to be brought to the Blue Spring Farm, where they lived in somewhat better circumstances for several years. In 1821, however, they were sold, likely as Johnson faced mounting financial pressures while maintaining his political career. There is also evidence that Julia occasionally found it difficult to maintain discipline on the plantation, given her status as an enslaved woman. Letters from Johnson show that he instructed his white employees to obey her authority, yet historians note that some enslaved field hands ignored her orders, and neighbouring men were unwilling to intervene when she sought their help in punishing them. In the summer of 1833, Julia became very ill as cholera swept across the American Midwest. Cholera was known as the Blue Death in the 19th century, as it came in vast waves across Europe and then the Americas between the 1810s and 1890s, killing millions of people. This included a cholera outbreak at the Choctaw Academy, and many students grew ill. For weeks, Julia nursed the children back to health, but eventually she contracted the disease. She passed away as a result, and was one of the many victims in the 1830s, which was the deadliest period for the disease. We cannot be sure what age she was when she died. She was either in her early 40s or late 30s. Her place of burial is also unknown. After Julia's death, Richard reportedly grieved deeply. In the years that followed, he entered into a relationship with another enslaved woman on the plantation. When she later left him for another man, Johnson had her seized and sold at auction. He subsequently began a similar relationship with her sister, who was also enslaved. Julia's story was forgotten about for many decades. In fact, it should actually be called a cover-up. During the presidential election of 1836, there was a lot of negative publicity surrounding Richard's private life and his scandalous relationship with a slave woman. For example, broadsides circulated that attacked Richard Mentor Johnson because of his relationship with Julia Chinn and their two daughters. In one cartoon from 1836, Johnson is shown alongside both his daughters, one of whom holds a portrait of Chinn. The artist deliberately darkened the skin tones of Chinn and the girls to heighten the racial stigma and ridicule him publicly. Still, despite the controversy surrounding his personal life, Richard Mentor Johnson was elected vice president on the ticket of Martin Van Buren. In 1850, Johnson was still working in politics, but by that time his physical and mental health were already in decline. He died of a stroke on November 19th, at the age of 70. He was buried in Frankfort Cemetery in Frankfort. His daughters with Julia had been given substantial farms as dowries and had married white men, yet they wouldn't receive anything from his will. Following his death, two of his brothers who were still alive at the time, John and Henry Johnson, appeared to have destroyed Richard's papers and other records. There were probably two motives here. Firstly, they wanted to erase all memory of Richard's controversial relationship and the two daughters he had with Julia. Secondly, While he was not an enormously wealthy man at the time that he died, Richard did leave a large enough estate that his two brothers wanted to acquire it, rather than it passing to Imogen, who was still alive in 1850. They found a judge who was willing to assist them in ensuring that Richard's mixed-race daughter did not inherit his lands. The court declared he left no widow, children, father, or mother living, and so the falsified will was entered into the official record. With Richard's papers destroyed and his estate having passed to his brothers and their families, the story of Julia Chinn was silenced to some extent. That is until the late 20th century, when passing reference was made in publications to the Vice President of the United States and his enslaved wife. These references aroused enough interest in several researchers in recent years that various studies of her life and times have been published, including a full book-length biography by Amrita Chakrabarti Myers. Thus, the story of Julia Chinn, the Vice President's slave wife, has been reclaimed from obscurity. Although much of Blue Spring Farm has disappeared, efforts by local preservationists to stabilize the surviving stone building of Choctaw Academy have helped ensure that at least part of the place where she lived and worked will endure. In this way, the memory of Julia Chinn, once largely erased from history, continues to be rediscovered and remembered. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Julia Chinn. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.